Hello everybody, welcome back. I wanted to show you a few information points about how we calculate points and victory in our meta triangular league. So for basic information about the league, there's a video on YouTube. You can watch that to be brought back up to speed. The concept is that we play 3 triangular leagues. The winner of each of these 3 leagues enters the final triangular league. Now the question is, how do you determine the winner of each such league? So let's focus on the league that we will play with the German division, where we have the Vampire Counts, the Inferno Dwarves and the Empire of Sonsdal. Imagine that there's a first game being played between Empire of Sonsdal and Inferno Dwarves, and that the Empire wins. In the second game between the Inferno Dwarves and the Vampire Covenant, the Inferno Dwarves win and the Vampire Covenant loses. And in the last game, the Empire wins against the Vampire. In this case, it's easy. The Empire is the only faction that has won 2 out of 2 games, and so it is the winner. But what happens if the last match ends with the Vampire winning and the Empire losing? In this case, each faction has played 2 games, 1 win, 1 loss, so there's no clear winner. And it's also a problem if there's a win and a draw for 2 of the 3 factions. So generally speaking, the point is that with only 3 matches being played, we need more granularity if we want to have a chance of determining the winner without needing to play extra games. So how do we do this? How do we achieve this in the Meta Triangular League? Well, to explain that, let's go back for a second and talk about the victory conditions that we have in Essence of War to begin with. Now, in Essence of War, players play 4 turns, and at the end of the 4th turn, you look at all the units that are left on the battlefield. And let's imagine, for example, on the side of the Empire, that you have the Electoral Cavalry over there, then you have the Handgunners down here, and then you have the Imperial Guard together with the General Wizard at the center. And on the other side, you would have the Tauruk for the Infernal Dwarves, then the Hobgoblins, the levies, the Vassal levies, and then the Citadel Guard and the General, the Prophets. Now, how do you determine victory normally? Well, first of all, in this scenario, once you have all the units mapped down, you remove the units that are fleeing. For example, imagine that the Electoral Cavalry is fleeing, you don't consider that, you remove that from the battlefield. You also remove the lone characters. If a general is on its own, you remove it, like the Prophet here. If a general is within a unit, like the Wizards with the Imperial Guard, then it stays. But if it's solo, then it gets removed. Then what else? At this point, you would look at all the units that are within 6 inches from the center of the battlefield. You keep those. Each unit that's beyond 6 inches from the center of the battlefield, you remove. This is, for example, the case for the Handgunners from the Empire that you can remove, and same thing applies to the Tauruk. So at the end of the game, you have these 3 units, one which is the unit of Imperial Guard for the Empire. It also has the general inside, but it only counts as the combined unit. And then the 2 units of Vassal Levies and of Citadel Guard for the Infernal Dwarves. These are the units that are left on the battlefield. The Inferno Dwarves player gets 2 points, and the Imperial player gets 1 point. So this is how normally you play. The player with most points wins the battle. Now, what we do in the Meta Triangular League is that we note these points at the end of the battle, and then we subtract them and add them to the points of each faction. Each of the 3 factions starts the league with 9 points. Then, in the case of the Empire, for example, you would add 1 point, because it's the 1 point that the Empire has made at the end of this game. But then you would subtract 2, because the Inferno Dwarves made 2 points. And similarly, the Inferno Dwarves would have 2 points, and then you would subtract 1, because the Empire also had a unit in there, all right? So this is how you start calculating things. Now we represent this in gray because they have played a first match. Okay? Now let's imagine that the Vampire Covenant plays against the Empire on Sonstal, and at the end of the game the Vampire have all 3 units inside the 6 inches victory zone, and the Empire has 2. So this means that the Vampire Covenant would win by 1 point, and the Empire would lose by 1 point. Okay, so this would be the final result. Also, the Empire has now played both matches, so has completed the Triangular League, and the Vampires are now in grey. Okay? So there's one final match to be played, which is between the Inferno Dwarves and the Vampire Covenant. And imagine that this game ends in a draw, 1-1 each. So this means that there's no change in the overall points. It's just become black because now it means that the entire series has been played. And at this point, it's clear that the Empire has lost, but who won? The Inferno Dwarves or the Vampire Covenant? We have a tie, and we have to break the tie. And so we have a series of rules that allow us to determine the winner there. So the way to do this is to consider that the Inferno Dwarves scored 2 points against the Empire, and the Vampire scored 3 points against the Empire. Even if in the end, since the Empire did 1 against the Dwarves and 2 against the Vampires, it ended up being the same, but the active points that have been scored are 2 in favor of the Inferno Dwarves and 3 in favor of the Vampire Covenant. And so in the end, it's based on point that the Vampire Covenant wins. So to recap, in each Triangular League, every faction starts with 9 points. Then you get +1 at the end of each game for every scoring unit, for every unit that's not fleeing and it's not a lone character unit in the victory zone. -1 for every unit for the opponent. And then you break ties in favor of the direct winner. This was not the case in our example because it was a 1 versus 1 in the last game between the Vampire Covenant and the Inferno Dwarves. But then you can break ties in favor of the faction that had the most scoring units, as in the case of the Vampire Covenant. Okay? So this is the main structure. There's one final thing that we should be talking about, which is penalties. And we give -1 to both players for each game when there is slow play. And slow play is defined as a game that lasts more than 1 hour, so that we keep the live stream snappy and exciting. If the game lasts more than 1 hour, both players get -1. I can also attribute as the arbiter, as the referee of the game, -1 or +1 for sportsmanship. And for example, this is also the case. You can imagine that I would give a +1 if there's one player that is clearly not being the driving force behind the slow play, for example. So -1 to both for slow play, -1 or +1 individually, discretion of the referee for sportsmanship. And then, once we have that, if there is still a tie that hasn't been resolved with the method that I have shown you previously, then you would use these points for sportsmanship to break the tie. And so the first way of breaking the tie would be in favor of the player that didn't get any sportsmanship malus. Then, if that's not the case, the tie is broken in favor of the player that didn't get any malus for slow play. And then, if that's not enough, the player that didn't get any bonus from me for sportsmanship points. If that's still not the case, then we try and break the tie with a rematch by scheduling yet another match. But the point is that we're trying to avoid to have to play other matches because you have to schedule stuff in and it's never easy. So that's why we have so many different ways of having granularity in the decision of the winner and in breaking the tie. Since it can be necessary to play a rematch, then we take this possibility into consideration. But if for scheduling reasons that's not possible, well, you know what, tough luck. I'm the arbiter, I'm the judge, and I'm going to be the kingmaker and take the responsibility. Hopefully, it's not going to happen at all. Well, that's it. That's all I wanted to say. See you on Wednesday evening for the first match from the German division. Bye.